Hi, boys and girls. The last two chapters that we read, chapters 13 and 14, Edward was discovered by a hobo named Bull and Lucy, his dog. He was rescued from the garbage dump where Lawrence and Nellie's daughter had taken him. Um, let's just talk about the question from our read aloud yesterday, which was which owner was the best owner of Edward so far? So, of course, we have Abilene, and then once Edward was tossed overboard, he was rescued. He was brought up by a net from Lawrence's net, um, and Lawrence and Nellie became his owners. Um, and now we have him with Bull and Bull's dog Lucy. So there was a couple of different owners that he's had so far, and we see that he's also growing and becoming a caring, rabbit. He's starting to develop feelings and emotions, and he's starting to actually care about the people around him. I really liked reading all of your ideas. Some of you thought that Abilene was the best owner because she had fancy clothes for him and she packed his suitcase to go on the trip on the ship with her, and she, cared a lot about him. And others thought that, Nellie was a great owner, and because she spoke to him and sang him lullabies. Um, and then some of you thought that Bull was a great owner because he traveled around and they shared many years together and he developed emotions. Um, all of those were really wonderful answers, and I really enjoyed reading all of your responses and the details that you provided to just back up what your ideas were. Let's continue. So now we have that he is on a field staring up at the stars. That was the last thing that we read. And he was saying the names of the people that he had missed. You know, he was saying Bull and Lucy. And he was thinking about the people that he loved. Okay, let's keep going. Chapter 15. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. "Hm," she said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. "Looks like a rabbit," she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. "Only he ain't real." She stood back up. "Hm," she said again, and she rubbed her back. "What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say." Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. "Pick me up or don't pick me up," the rabbit thought. "It makes no difference to me." The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I sing." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. "I've seen troubles too," he thought. "You bet I have. And apparently they aren't over yet." Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to a wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the pole. Pie tins are like those metal containers that are on the bottom of a pie. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. "Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can't scare them off," the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, said the woman. She clapped her hands. You got to act ferocious. Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh aloud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. Get to work, Clyde, she said. Scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him, out of the garden and toward her small house. So if you can't picture it, that's what Edward has become. So the old woman has turned Edward, a beautiful china rabbit, into a makeshift scarecrow to scare away the birds from eating her crops. And apparently she's calling him Clyde. And these pie tins, right here, these are on the bottom of pies. They make kind of a sound that would scare a bird away, when the wind blows at them. All right, I wonder how, now that Edward is starting to feel emotions, I wonder how he would be feeling right now up there. Kind of would feel very sad. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads in his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw, 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 without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I'm done with caring. Caw, caw, said the Pellegrina crow. Finally the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. You are down there alone, the stars seemed to say to him. We are up here, in our consolations, together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you're all alone now? Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. Oh, so now we have a new character. A little boy. Bryce, said the old woman, get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare. Yes, ma'am, said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown with flecks of gold shining in them. Hey, he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head, and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, Go on, get! And the bird spread his wings and flew away. Bryce! Shouted the old woman. Ma'am, said Bryce. Get away from that rabbit. Do your work. I ain't going to say it again. Yes'm, said Bryce. He wiped his hand across his nose. I'll be back to get you, he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved. The birds circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What was it like to have wings? Edward wondered. If he had had wings, when he was tossed overboard, he would not have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up into the deep, bright blue sky. And when Lolly took him to the dump, he would have flown out of the garbage and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw, caw, caw. In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the field. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lightened on Edward's shoulder and tapped him with his beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit, with each tap, that he had no wings, that not only could he not fly, he could not move on his own at all, in any way. Dusk descended over the field, and then came true dark. A whippoorwill sang out over and over again. A whippoorwill, if you don't know, is a type of bird. It gets its name because the sound that it makes sounds like the word whippoorwill. Whippoorwill, whippoorwill. It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard. And then came another song, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. Hey, he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then played another bit of song on the harmonica. I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but here I am. I come to save you. Too late, thought Edward as Bryce climbed the pole and worked at the wires that were tied around his wrists. I'm nothing but a hollow rabbit. Too late, thought Edward as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. I am only a doll made of china. But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. Perhaps, he thought, it was not too late, after all, for me to be saved. All right, guys. So now Edward is with the boy named Bryce. All right. I hope you're enjoying the story.